I am Jenny Savino. I am the director of the Alumni Office at Andover, and it is my great pleasure and privilege to open this evening's program. To tell us about tonight, I'm going to turn it over to our Abbott Academy Fund president and member of the Abbott at Andover Committee, Beth Homestone. Beth?
Hello. Welcome, everyone, and welcome from the Abbott at Andover, a committee of the Andover Alumni Council. We represent Abbott from the circle up to the hill, and many alumni are members of this group or have been members of this group. We want to issue a special welcome tonight to Julia Alvarez, Abbott 67. In thinking about tonight and about Julia, I was reminded of two words in the opening of Howard's End: only connect. Tonight, we're so fortunate to connect with Julia Alvarez. For us in the class of Abbott 66, this connects us back to our beloved classmate, Maury Alvarez, Julia's sister. And speaking of sisters, one cannot think of Julia without thinking of sisterhood. And many of us connect Abbott with a sisterhood among classmates. And many of us are part of a family sisterhood as well. My little book group in Vermont read Afterlife last summer. And sitting around talking about it, we discovered that about 4 of us, it wasn't a large group, were parts of sisterhood. We had sisters, 3 or 4 sisters each. So it was really an interesting discussion for us, and we all talked about how important Julia's books had been to us as part of family sisterhood. Vermont is fortunate to claim Julia as one of its own. And I am fortunate to connect with Julia as a fellow Vermonter as well. I read her latest book, Afterlife, and I could swear I met some of those characters in Afterlife. They were so real to me as a Vermonter. We also connect to Julia in her stories that she writes. We connect with the stories of grief and of the fate of immigrants, of mental illness, and so much more. They are truly timely and timeless for us. So Julia, we're thrilled to have you and to have the opportunity to reconnect with you this evening. And I'm now going to turn the program over to Jineyda Tapia, and I'd like to tell you just a little bit about Jineyda. She teaches English 100 and 2 senior electives. In her classes, she has included Julia Alvarez's In the Time of the Butterflies. She has had the pleasure of meeting Julia several times up at Middlebury through her work with Andover Bread Loaf, where she is one of the directors. And I'd like to make another connection here. The Abbott Academy Fund has supported Andover Bread Loaf on numerous occasions through grants that we make. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jineyda Tapia. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Julia. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. Get comfortable. This is a conversation. This is family. This is Abbott family, right? One of the things that I am just thrilled to be talking to Julia about is her experience as a student in Abbott. So Julia, just some background. When I was teaching English 100 a couple years ago, the 25th anniversary of In Time of the Butterflies was being celebrated. And of course I had to pick the first introduction of myself to your work and to teach it here to these students. And the kids just blew up with it, and they went researching about your life. And we even tapped into Paige Roberts, the director of archives, and try to find old writing by you. And essentially, one of the things that kids really want to know at Phillips Academy is, how was Julia Alvarez in Abbott? How was she as a student? What inspired her?
Well, first of all, so many thank yous to give everybody. Beth for reaching out to me and remembering Maudie and all of Maudie's classmates. I noticed a few names there that are familiar. Thank you so much. is very meaningful to come back to a place that was so formative for me and for Maori. And to Jenny, and of course, Jineyda, thank you so much. I met you way back when you were just a young person up at Bread Loaf. And to my classmates who are here, I told them all they didn't have to come. They put in enough frequent flyer miles, listening to Alvarez, 3 years at Abbott, and then all the reunions, and then all the emails we share. So, but I'm really touched that they show up, real sisters. So anyhow, what was I like? Maybe you should ask them how Abbott was for me. I wrote a poem actually called Abbott Academy about landing at Abbott. I went there in 1964, and I called myself only 4 American years old then, because we had come to the United States in 1960. So I wasn't that at home in the American culture. And then to be put in Abbott, that was a whole different thing. And I was terrified and homesick and afraid. And I didn't think I would ever fit in. I, had lucked out with a wonderful roommate, Sarah Beal, whom we've lost, but she was like a big sister. And these incredible women that were there, more incredible even as we have come back and reunited, realizing, my gosh, we all felt left out. We all felt scared. Why didn't I know that? What was it like? One thing, coming from the DR, this, Jineyda, I hadn't been raised to think of myself as someone that would get past a high school education, and suddenly, women were, not that I didn't have powerful women in my family, but they were not out there in the world. Entre familia, they ruled, but it was not, you didn't have a public life, a career, a higher education. And then suddenly to get into Abbott, and all our teachers were female, basically. And, they were there to make us strong, powerful, smart, educated women. And so it was eye-opening to me. And I lucked into some really great teachers, especially English teachers, who took me in hand. And I fell in love with poetry, with writing. So even though I say I came to the United States and to the English language late, I came to my calling of writing young because of the teachers I had at Abbott.
Julia, it's interesting because my village at Phillips Academy indirectly has been supported by Abbott, because Dr. Flavia Vidal, who's on the call, she's the director of the Brace Center for Gender Studies.
Oh, wow.
She has this ability to just get all the women together, and specifically all the women of color as well. And it's created a home at Phillips Academy that's essentially a home away from home, as you have said. And I know those are some of the themes that come up in Afterlife as well.
Community and storytelling, and yep.
And I think, to segue into Afterlife, one of the questions that I'm interested in discussing with you is, how is Afterlife for you a home? I feel your writing is a home away from home in many ways. And how does this new book, after waiting for you for so long, mind you, I've read your young adult stuff because I have a 6-year-old and I share your work always with students. But after waiting so long, it's fit into the bookshelf. It's created a home next to all my other Julia Alvarez book. How do you see this home of Afterlife?
Well, first of all, I felt like we came to the United States looking for the land of the free, the home of the brave, all the things we were taught, and getting away from a dictatorship, what awaited us. And then we turn on the TV, and there was Martin Luther King, the civil rights movement, people of color being hosed down. It didn't feel very welcoming out there in the world. In the playground at our school, the kids made fun of us and taunted us. And it didn't feel like a very welcome, it didn't feel like the land of liberty, the big table set for all that my parents had said America would be. But then I discovered reading. And I feel like within the covers of books, between the covers of books, I discovered what we had come looking for in the United States of America, the grand democracy of storytelling, the place where everyone is welcome. And I feel like, I used for my first book ever, an epigraph from Czesław Miłosz, and it's language is the only homeland. For me, I would, because I'm a writer, I have to revise even famous writers' words. I would say storytelling is the only homeland. So I feel like this is where I feel deeply connected, where I sort of lose myself in the other, which is the powerful thing about reading and about writing, that you become the other. I mean, if we all could do that, what kind of a world we would have? You become the other when you read. So for me, writing has always been a way to connect with the largest community out there. Afterlife took me so long to write because I felt like I've been writing, and I never like to do the same thing, because then I'm not learning as a writer. And if I'm not learning as a writer, my reader isn't learning as a reader. And I didn't just want to repeat stories and formulas or whatever that worked. I use writing as a way to understand what can't be put into words, sort of that sort of cutting edge of my life. And so I really was curious about elderhood. I feel like I wanted to write what the experience of growing old in this craft and as a person, what that is like. And I felt like when I first started writing, there was this gap in the shelf of no characters, Latinos, writers. Back then, there was no such thing as multiculturalism or ethnic writers or even African-American literature, when I was at Abbott. So, I sort of wanted to write to that gap when I wrote about Latino characters. I wanted to read the stories that I needed to understand and that I wasn't finding in books. It's a great democracy of reading and storytelling, but you have to join and add to it to enlarge it and enlarge it. But one gap I was noticing as I was growing older is the dearth of older female characters, especially older Latina characters that weren't just like the cliches, the abuelita, the gruñona, the silver-haired wife of the patriarch. I wanted to find out, what is this experience of elderhood? What do you become in the world? What is your place in the world when the world is done with you in that consumer culture productivity way? What are the issues? If you spent a life, let's say, believing in stories and in words, what happens? How do you avail yourself of them when a real crisis comes to your door? It's one thing to speak academically of some of these issues, but what about when justice and all these concepts that you've taught and written about shows up as an unwed pregnant teenager, undocumented in your garage? So it's a long answer, but
No, but
you get what what I want.
yes, and I have to say, Julia, that with your works, first of all, you opened the doorway for so many Latina writers now. There's so many Dominican American writers right now that are writing, and all of us are centered around your stories. So to grow up with you and then see you as our elder, as our literary elder, and then have you write a book where the main character is an elder, to me has been, I just haven't read anything like that before. I haven't read it from that cultural perspective, but I also wanna dive into Antonia a little bit. She is not only just a stereotype, not the stereotype, but she brings in an interesting clash that we have as folks that are ni de aquí ni de allá, not from here, not from there, which is how do you assimilate to American cultures in ways that you don't lose yourself but also in ways that you become something else.
Mhm.
And in that, as a reader, I saw many different afterlives in your book. It
Wow.
wasn't just Sam's death, right? There's so many afterlife with, culturally speaking. Can you speak to those different afterlives that Antonia has to go through as a character?
God, Jineyda, I have been on so many Zooms and nobody's ever said something like that. And so it really, I don't have a ready answer, but you're absolutely right. The many afterlives, I mean, it's also part of growing older. Afterlife doesn't refer to a religious sense of afterlife, but that if you live long enough, you have many little deaths. Many things die. People, places, selves you wanted to be, beliefs you had. But if you're resilient and keep into the larger version of yourself, then you have an afterlife and an afterlife and an afterlife. But what you've pinpointed to is that as an immigrant or dual culture, you're constantly moving between one life and another. And how do you keep the life after the immersion life in one is over? How do you keep those values and those parts of yourself growing? And I think one of the things I love about stories is that they don't give you any answers. So I hope I hope you've announced that to all your classes. If you came here to get answers, the best stories pose the questions correctly, as Chekhov said. The task of the writer is not to answer the questions, but to state them correctly. So the novel is a way to investigate that. And I think part of the thing is that I wanted to be honest to is that it's an ongoing. There's never a done deal. You never got it figured out, the right equation of how much Dominican, how much American, how much of the past. It's an evolving thing. And you think that you've got the equation right, and then something happens and things come up that you didn't even know were still there from old cultures or old ways of being. So it's a constantly evolving quest and question, which I think doesn't just apply to being an ethnic. I think it applies to being, as my students would say, woke, being awake in your life. You're constantly reshaping, reinventing. So the many afterlives of Antonia, yes, many of them.
And I think with Antonia, what is interesting to me is the crisis, right? You have a young woman and a young man who are asking her for help to essentially step into a new identity that she's not used to, which essentially is an activist, right? How much can you watch a crisis and not act? And, she does it, I joke, en fogoná. She doesn't really want to do it. She's being dragged into this role of this crisis. And, I asked a couple Latinas if they can ask you any questions, what would they be? And I wanted to align it with your book to see what knowledge and wisdom you can give us from that. And Casi Infante actually asked a question. She's on the Zoom. She used to be in OAR. Now she's doing amazing things in Lawrence and at Harvard University. And she asked, through the lens of these books, what advice would you give to aspiring civic leaders around resisting these dominant narratives that put us in a box? And not just dominant narratives that are out there in media, but also about ourselves before we even get to define ourselves, which is essentially what I think Antonia's journey is.
Oh boy, that's a tough question. I think you're right to say that Antonia is a reluctant activist, and I wanted to change and complicate the narrative. Everyone assumes because she's married to a white mainstream, Midwestern man that his activism is because of his Latina wife, when in fact he is the activist and she is the reluctant activist. She's got more, is more reclusive and wants to pull back and isn't necessarily wanting to be involved. Plus she's still grieving. And she feels like, well, in our cultures, when someone's in duelo, that's like, you don't bother them. Duelo is the mourning period. A person gets an excuse slip from everything. So that's where the old culture is coming in, saying, this is, you don't have to do this. This is your duelo. But how can you not, as you say, when you're pulled into it, how can you not respond? She's been teaching about, compassion and beauty and truth. Well, what happens when it knocks on your door at an inconvenient time? What advice do you give? Well, the advice is you don't give advice. You have to work it out each time, and she keeps asking herself those three Tolstoy questions, who is the most important one? What is the right time to act? She's constantly having to evaluate it. And also, and this is to me, the biggest activism, to go for the larger version of yourself. And what that means, nobody can tell you except yourself. I mean, nobody can say, you're not doing this, that, or the other. What is, to do work that you love in the world is, to me, the deepest activism, because it's sending a gush of love into the world. It's not anger, it's not fury, it's not destructiveness, it's love. So to do the work that you love and then to make it something that you serve the world with, to me, that's activism. And it doesn't always look like activism. So, I think of Howard Thurman, the civil rights activist, saying that don't ask what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive and go out and do it, because what the world needs is people who have come alive. So I think that's a bottom line. However, and this is the great thing about literature, on the other hand, it's complex, and sometimes you do have to put down your pen and show up on the front lines, and be there and serve in that way, because the community also needs you to join in. But it's the balances that I think are tricky, and that nobody can dictate to another. I think we have to figure those things out, and it's tough, because people will tell you what's the right kind of Latina, what's the right kind of activist, what's the right, and that's flattening and othering. It's not allowing diversity within the person or within a community.
And I think with that, if I may pivot, Julia, Lorena Hedman also sent me a question, and she's a Brello for like myself. And one of the things she asked as a writer herself is, as a Dominicana writer, how are you in ways not allowing yourself to be pigeonholed? Because you're such an elder in our community. You were one of the first writers for us, for many of us that were, ni de aquí ni de allá. So what are some ways that you don't allow yourself to be pigeonholed? And also, what are some fears that you had when you first began to write? And what truths in your life led you past those fears?
Oh boy, that last one is a big one. I've been writing for, I guess, since Abbott. I mean, I still remember that I went to actually an Abbott graduate. I don't know what year she was, maybe 1947, Jean Young. And she was an editor at, I think it was Doubleday. And I don't know how through, a classmate of hers that was a friend of my aunt. They talked to her to let me come visit so I could see because I was at Abbott and I wanted to be a writer. And so I thought, I'm going to go see a real editor at a publishing company. So I put together a manuscript of all my poems, handwritten. Can you imagine? Una tijerita of like, 16, 17.
Lappy.
But yeah, and she was so gracious. She said she was delighted. She would read it. And she actually did write me back. And I said, be sure to send it back because it's my only copy. And she took me through the place. And that was magical for me. But by way of saying that I started writing back then, but my first novel, García, How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents, wasn't published till I was 41. So I had already been writing for over 20 years, seriously. I mean, past college. And back then, people didn't know what to do with writers from ethnic backgrounds. They thought it was sociology. They didn't know what to do. I got so many rejections. And so I didn't ever think that I would be part of American literature. I thought the little poem that meant so much to me by Langston Hughes, I Too Sing America, about being an African-American writer. And he was sent to the kitchen while at the big table, the important writers were sitting. And from the kitchen, he says, but someday I'll be at that table. And I loved reading that poem because it was like a promise to me. But I did feel for a long time that I was in the kitchen of minor writers. And then, it's sort of like America exploded and they discovered multiculturalism, writers of color, African-American writers, and they began to be in the curriculum. So it was a long haul there. I was lucky in that I had a wonderful agent who was my agent, Sandra Cisneros' agent, Ana Castillo's agent, and she just kept knocking on doors because I would have gotten demoralized. So it was a long road to get to be, feel like I had any credibility as a writer. And so, Jineyda, I've gone on and I've forgotten the question.
No, I think you answered it. It's what are some of these fears? And I'm just thinking about
terror.
Yes.
I didn't know
that your voice is part of American literature. Here I am.
Yeah.
Julia, it's American literature.
And I remember some, well-meaning teachers who praised my writing as an undergraduate. But if I had a Tia Rosa, they would circle. It should be Aunt Rose. And the minute a character became Aunt Rose, I lost her. It couldn't be Tia Rosa if her name was Aunt Rose. So I didn't know whether I would be, allowed in. And I still think it's with me, that to tell you the truth. I think someone once asked me what my writing process was, and it's changing now. Because as an elder, I can't run that fast. But I used to say, staying one sentence ahead of the Furies. That was my writing process. The Furies are all the naysayers, all the judgment, all that you don't belong here, all that you go back to where you came from, all that you don't know what you're doing, all those naysayers. And all I have to do is stay one sentence ahead of them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm thinking of Antonia, and I feel there's, especially with her relationship with her sisters, right? There's a push and pull there that are the expectations of what is expected of all of them. Even Izzy as the elder, right? Like she's supposed to be la responsable, but she's the hot mess in the book. But there's also that with each other, they can essentially provide themselves mirrors and see their true selves. And it just, to me as a reader, it's extremely interesting how sometimes maybe the question of who are we is not individualistic, it's within community.
Yeah. And I think that's something Antonia discovers in the course of the novel, that it's really that her afterlife, to go back to the concept you brought, her afterlife, her renewal comes in community. And she had it in a sense when she was teaching in the classroom. And that's part of what she's constantly, missing, that those students, that community, the questions she could ask, the ways that they could, discover and support each other in that community. And that's gone for her. So I think that's, the importance of community, and, for sisters, how important that is. I think when we came to this country, having each other is what saved us, because mommy and papi, they couldn't really help us navigate in this world. In fact, in a sense, we became a little bit like their parents, guiding them and teaching them things of this new culture. But we had each other. And, that allowed us to air out, support each other, figure things out together, do our Spanglish with nobody saying, pero, one or the other. We didn't have to do the either ors with each other, because we were that messy hybrid that is a hyphenated person, and so it allowed for a richer experience of self than.
And I think you show that richer sense of community, because the sisterhood is not stereotypical either. There are frictions there, and it makes me think of how sometimes your home can be a place of great joys, but also great sorrow. And with Izzy especially, and your introduction with mental health, I find that piece very interesting. And in the way that you didn't deal with it in such a stereotypical way, but also it's por de abajo. It's there, but it's on the bottom of it until it explodes. And in that sense, how do you, as a writer, see the way that we deal with mental health and try to portray that in your novel?
Well, that's a question that I think Antonia really is grappling with, because she sees in Issy certain nobility of spirit and generosity and largeness, which is something she really admires. And maybe it would have survived in the origin culture, but that really is an issue that interested me, how we pathologize behaviors that in other cultures took care of us, but when you bring them stateside, or you bring something stateside there, it can be your destruction. It just doesn't work. It can't take care of who you have to become in order to survive here. So I didn't have any solutions. One of the things that I was concerned with, and that I have been, in fact, because of my sisters, two of them who are therapists, is that they were originally trained in Eurocentric models of normalcy and what is pathology, that didn't address the ways in which other cultures take care of each other and stay healthy, spiritually, mentally, emotionally. And so, that's part of the issue that I want to, that Antonia keeps grappling with. It's so much easier to have, and this is not to minimize mental illness of any kind, because that also is there, but how sometimes if we can get a handle and pathologize a behavior, we don't have to deal with it. Yeah. And this keeps happening in the novel, not just in terms of mental illness, but in terms of the other. I mean, Antonia, who wants to be liberal and welcoming and big-hearted and big-minded, she has these ideas, about her redneck neighbor, about the sheriff. She has these, and what I constantly had had happened in the novel was she's constantly, those are being unpacked and complicated in ways that throw all those labels out the window. And I think it's something that happens in terms of what we were talking about with mental illness and pathology, but also in terms of the world we're living in now, you know, how difficult it is to stay open and curious and not, you know, what did she say? Antonia's, sometimes she teaches me things that I say, oh, that's a good way to put it, Antonia, forgetting that I'm writing her, but she throws someone down the othering chute, you know, like a laundry chute. She just puts them down that chute with a label. And it turns out to be a lot more complicated and interesting.
And I think your novel reflects the times. Everything is being disrupted right now. Even our sense of what is un Dominicano, what is a Dominican, what is an American, what is our relationships to our sheriffs that we used to think are friendly? And then when that disruption happens, what is the friction there? And I think one of the things that I wanted to ask you, especially with the book, is it just seems that you're always talking about our time right now. And right now, everyone's questioning who they are, I feel like. And everyone's trying to think about self-care and how the self-care looks like. And even that's disrupted because it's through a Eurocentric lens, right?
Yeah.
And I think with the sisterhood, and especially the sisters, what are some ways that you feel their roots ground them, even as these disruptions threaten their very existence?
Well, I think that having a sense of, even if it's a very small community, of each other and of supporting each other and coming together and you know, having that ground, which is what's left of, you know, the original family, because now they're all elders in a way, and the tias and the madrinas and the people that maybe knitted them together are all gone. So having that community is important. I think friendships that she makes and connections that she makes with these young people, with that young, you know, undocumented couple, and she gets involved in their story. And I think that maybe is part of our cultures, you know, in the sense of thinking of Dominican cultures, is that we're never raised as a me only. We're a little bead in the necklace of the generations, you know. From the minute we're born, ay, tiene la nariz de su tía, she's got so and so, she's got her great aunt's ears, she's got, you know, even before we're aware of ourselves, we already belong to all the people that are there. So I think that sense of community can be grounding as to, you know, writing to the times we're living in. Before the pandemic, you know, before this was written before the pandemic, I already felt we were living in what I call elegiac times, seeing the end of so many things, you know, with climate change, the extinction of species, you know, the horrible storms, coastlines going underwater, in the, you know, in terms of civic life, the divisiveness, the violence against communities of color, the lack of civilities, gun violence. I mean, it felt like we were living at a time where so many things were ending, coming apart. And part of my challenge with Antonia and as a person is, how do we live in a world that is broken without succumbing to the smaller version of ourselves and losing faith and hope and love in ourselves or each other? How do we keep, you know, pushing against that tide and that certainly is our moment now in a huge way, in a global way. It was always there, but the pandemic has brought it forward that we are in this together, and so.
In ways, Julia, I think it almost made the invincible visible. And I know that's something her husband chastises her for at a point, where it's this idea that who's invisible to who. And I think of Mario as him being a worker of the land. And in this country, so many of our migrant workers and undocumented workers are invisible to us. And yet they are at the center. We literally cannot eat without them.
Yeah.
And that contrast right there. And she's forced to, I think with the pandemic and the disruptions and everything, we are forced to see things that have been invisible before.
Exactly. I mean, thank you, truckers. Yeah. Thank you, essential workers. And who are they? They're the delivery guy who is out bringing food to people. They're the cashier there. They're the people that clean the hospitals, doctors and nurses, of course, a more visible face of it. But yeah, we sort of, and I hope it's something, I'm brokenhearted that there is a pandemic. And I hope that one of the things that comes out of this is that we don't forget this, that there isn't a post-pandemic, a return to normal. I hear that and me dan tiriquillo, as mommy would say. I don't want to hear that. We don't want to go back to the old ways, So I feel like, part of for Antonia, it's that her individual world fell apart within the first page of the novel. Everything she has assumed was going to be there is gone. And so she is really putting together her life. And I think we're all struggling with what that means for each of us in our own ways going forward. And not just as a country, but as a globe. Yeah.
Yeah. And Antonia teaches us that once we see it, we cannot ignore it.
Yeah.
Even
well, you can, Jineyda.
Well,
that's why we teach. That's why we teach stories, and that's why we keep telling the stories, because stories get inside us before we can protect ourselves by delighting us and enchanting us and making us feel accompanied. But in fact, in your imagination, in the bloodstream of your imagination is now traveling an other, is now this other way of seeing the world. And I think that's why reading is so powerful and liberal arts education are so powerful. It doesn't mean you have to be an English teacher or anything, it doesn't mean that you have to stay in that profession, but that it helps us. The same muscles we have to use to read and understand and identify, to me, are the same muscles that their social face is compassion and social activism, where you are aware, you can't close down to the other because the other is you. The other has gotten in you.
And that's what's interesting with Antonia, because she is a teacher, she's a professor.
Yeah.
And she has had the privilege of educating years after years, numerous people, right? And then when you are now the one that life is teaching you a lesson, and you think as a teacher, sometimes I joke with my students, I'm like, don't turn it around on me, go analyze that. Yeah. Go analyze here. What ends up happening with her as being a professor is that there is a privilege there of knowledge, of status, both socially and economically. And what I'm fascinated by through that privilege is that there's such a dominant narrative as somehow as Latinos are underserved, they're not privileged, they're otherized in this country, that in a way she offers a mirror to many people that are quote unquote middle class. And what happens when you have worked hard for that status, right, economically and socially, but that privilege has blinded you.
Yeah. This is also an issue that that we don't often address when we talk about diversity. And now terms that are much more complex and get at this, like intersectionality, that, sure, but what is your class? How light skinned are you? How much privilege have you been granted? Because how much are you a model Latina? All these things that complicate how we talk about diversity, and that we should be addressing, and also in the many ways that that Antonia, just by being Antonia and being a teacher and so forth, that she complicates others who just want to see her as, as just an immigrant, Dr. Sawyer's wife. And she's got her own, her own titles and so forth. But yeah, and also, if you're one of the lucky ones, that have gotten those privileges, what then is your responsibility to the community that doesn't have that? And that is a really a question that shows up in Antonia's garage, in her door. It's not just, as I said, academic. She has to face, what does that mean? What does she owe? And how is that going to play out in her life? In a way that is true to her character, because we have to act out of who we are. Because as the therapist, a therapist in the book says, if I try to be, if I try to be you, then who will be me? So you have to do it from that core.
And I think in that sense, I want to segue a little bit to one of my students who try to be you in a way. When we read In Time with the Butterflies, one of the things that she was fascinated by, and her name is Nena Okori, she's class of 22, is your ability to go into the lives of people you've never met in a fictional setting, in a fictional book. And I think with her, one of the questions that she's interested in is, how do you as a writer immerse yourself in the story of these characters and still separate Julia from an Antonia, from the Mirabal sisters, Julia from Joe? How do you manage it?
Well, that's, I think if you asked an actor or somebody who is also, who is involved in these kinds of storytellings and becoming the other, I think it's, for me, it's, I could get fancy in terms of studying character and doing my research, but, we get it from our cultures, growing up in Santeria, Santeria is that these spirit women would get possessed by a spirit and speak in her voice, and even the way they talk and walk, and their voice would changes, that it's a way of getting immersed and possessed. And there is a kind of possession, with this caveat that it might be how you write the character and get inside and move in the story, but then the crafts person in revision comes in and sees what is working in the story and what needs to be changed. And also, if they're lucky and have editors that they trust around them, those people can also help them identify where, the story needs to be worked. But there is that sense of immersion. And I'm a writer that really has to go there. I mean, if I have a character go shopping in a grocery store, I get in my car, I go to the grocery store, and I am looking to see, well, in what aisle is the dog food, and what would it be next to? And what is happening, and what are the I immersed myself. When I wrote In the Time of the Butterflies, I went there. I was with Dede Mirabal. I was in the house. She gave me free rein. I opened drawers. I touched the braid that she had cut off Maria Teresa when before burying her. I immersed myself in the world of the character. I read, and I also read books that are doing what I am trying to do, not because I want to copy them, but because these are my teachers. I'm reading as a writer. How did they put this together? How did they move that chapter along? How did they create this character? How did they? So I'm learning. So it's all, a process of both immersion and then, revision. And I always say that a piece of writing always wants one more draft than I want to give it.
There is like 2 pieces of artwork that I'll share with you that students created in my class and wanted me to share with you. So the last question, because I'm checking the time and I'm sure Jenny's gonna jump in soon. Julia, what is your legacy? What do you want it to be? We all have so many different love stories with you, and they're all, you are at the center of them. What would you like the afterlife of Julia Alvarez, the writer, to be like? What is the impact that you would like to have done through your writing?
I want my afterlife and people like you and those wonderful students and their questions. I want my stories to water their stories and to keep it going, because the stories don't have to have my name on it. They don't have to be about me. They're what is it that Jean Reese told a young writer? Feed the sea, feed the sea. That's the job. And I tell Bill all the time, he says, stop talking like that. But I said, when I die and they ring me, I don't want one drop to fall out. I want it to be all used up. So I think that's the thing, to feel like what your work has allowed the next generation and the next generation to do their work. What I said earlier, the deepest activism is to be doing the work you love in service to your community, because then you're adding love to the equation, and that's what's needed. So I don't want a plaque. I don't want a memorial. I don't want anything like that. The stories will be my legacy, but they're dead unless somebody like you picks it up and reads it, and that story has babies in the stories that you tell, so it keeps generating. And I think that's that's the legacy that I would want.
You live in our homes, Julia. You live in my students' hearts. These students I had 2 years ago, and I got so many, comments from them to ask you things. And you lived in all of our literary lives in the United States, because you created a mirror we can look at, not just Latinos, but everyone. So I want to thank you. Thank you for your time, Julia. I'm beyond humble. I can just gush on. And I have nothing to say other than we love you so much. And thank you for providing just words of wisdom. And an Antonia that I look at that, I'm like, okay, I have 50 years to go to get there, and I'll figure out what kind of Antonia I'll be when I get there.
That's great. They're so lucky they have you at Andover, your students, your colleagues, and I am so lucky to have you as a reader and dear compatriota and friend. And say hi to your mommy for me.
I will.
I'm taking a rain check on that Dominican supper. This is sancocho.
Yes, she already talking about it.
Yeah.
Gracias, Julia.
Thank you. And thank you, all my friends out there. I just feel so humble that you all are there. And Beth and Jenny and all my classmates, and Lou, wherever you are, and Dixie, if you're there. I mean, there's so many people if I start thanking, then I'll feel bad all night long that I forgot to say Thank you to so and so and so and so. So gracias, everybody. Take care of yourselves. And I guess what's our
Thank
next
you.
reunion? What's our
Thank
next
you.
reunion?
Thank
What's
you
our
so
next-
much.
Thank you, Julia.
Thank you.
Gracias, gracias.
Muchísimas
Gracias,
gracias, fantástica.
Oh my gosh. Look at
Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Gracias, Julia.
Gracias.
Oh, boy.
Gracias, Julia.
Qué placer, Juli.
Oh, hey.
She's so cute.
Ay, ay, ay. Oh my gosh. Oh boy.
Thank you,
Muy
Julia.
agradecida.
Julia.
Chao.
Oh my gosh.
Gracias.
This is wonderful.
Ay, ay,
You,
ay.
Julia.
That's the best.
Okay, no funeral for
Oh,
me.
bella.
My funeral. This is better than I
You're
get to be
such
alive
an
for it.
inspiration.
Ay, ay, ay. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you for the
you.
wonderful conversation, Jineyda.
Thank you.
Oh, wow. Ay, ay, ay. Oh, Jenny, this is too much. I'm gonna need a
Julia.
calmante. Oh,
This is
wait.
what, this is
We'll see you
family.
at the next reunion that Priscilla's going to organize.
Oh, wow. Oh, I love you guys. Thank you so much. This has been a gift to me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
You're a
you.
gift. You're a gift to us.
Hi, Beth.
Thank you so much.
I don't want to say
Hi,
goodbye.
Ruth.
Chao, gracias.
Whoa.
Flores, Julia.
I can't believe this. I'm so emotional. I cry if I didn't have makeup on. Okay. This is too much love.
Thank you, Julia.
We love you, Julia.
Gracias, señores. Gracias.
Yo quiero ir para ese sancocho.
Ay, sí, pero mira, dile a la mami de Jineyda que tiene que ser vegetariano. Yo soy una de esas dominicanas en Pomona.
No,
El
Julia.
sancocho vegetariano.
Don't make it for you, Julia, though. There's some other Latinas that are vegetarianas here. that my
I
mommy
know.
accommodate.
Sacamos un chin en el lado, un chin en el lado.
Un chin. There, she's a Dominicana. She says un chin.
Julia, there's a whole bunch of Dominican women at Phillips Academy, just for the record, and Latinas here. So come visit us.
Jineyda, we are everywhere. We are everywhere.
Julia, mi esposo dice que hay latino aquí también, que venga para acá.
Me voy para allá. Es que me hace falta estar con mi gente. Aquí en Vermont no hay mucho dominicano. Aquí no venden plátano, no venden, aquí no se consigue un plato de mangú, ni yuca, ni yuca con cebollito. Okay, Jenny, you better cut this off or we'll be here.
No one will leave until you leave, and everyone's
Okay.
happy to stay.
I
Believe
don't
me,
even
this
know
part
how to
I've been on
leave.
for hours.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay.
guys.
Okay, thank you. All
Everyone, thank you.
right, my love to
Bye.
everybody. Stay well.
Yes, stay healthy, everybody.
You too.
Jineyda, well done.
Sí, excelente, Jineyda. Thank you.